You ever had a neighbor so entitled they thought your land was their personal shortcut? That was Karen. Every morning, every evening, sometimes even in the dead of night, she'd drive her shiny SUV straight through my ranch gate like it was a revolving door. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I realized, this was her way of proving she didn't care about rules or respect. But she underestimated one thing. I wasn't about to let some self-proclaimed HOA queen trample my property. So, I set a trap, and when Karen hit it, she never saw it coming. There's a certain kind of quiet you only get on a ranch in the early morning. It's not silence, exactly, there's the occasional nicker from the horses, the low murmur of cattle shifting in the pasture, the creak of wood as the sun warms the fence posts, but it's a peaceful quiet, a rhythm that settles deep in your bones. I'd gotten used to waking with the land, pouring my coffee while watching the mist roll off the hills, and starting my day by walking down to the old ranch gate that marked the boundary between my property and the road. That gate wasn't much to look at, just sturdy wood and steel hinges I'd replaced twice in the last year, but it meant something. It meant boundary, it meant respect, and up until the summer Karen showed up, everyone in this part of town understood that. The first time it happened, I didn't even think much of it. I was mending a section of fence along the west pasture when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel that didn't belong to me. I turned, half expecting to see a delivery truck that got lost or maybe a neighbor looking for a shortcut around a fallen tree. Instead, it was a shiny white SUV, polished to the point of gleaming, rolling straight through my gate like it had every right to. The gate swung open, bounced once against the post, and then just hung there while the SUV barreled across my land like it was some county-maintained road. At the wheel was a woman I didn't recognize, sunglasses perched on her nose, chin tipped up with the kind of confidence you only see in people who never had to sweat for a living. She didn't look left, didn't look right, just gunned it straight across, hit the opposite side, and drove out the north gate like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood there with my hammer in hand, dumbfounded. I thought maybe she was lost, maybe her GPS had glitched. Folks take wrong turns all the time around here. So I told myself, let it slide, no harm done. I shut the gate, muttering about city people and their sense of direction, and went back to work. But I should have paid closer attention to that chin tilt, that smug little lift of her head as she drove off. That wasn't the look of a lost woman. That was the look of someone who'd just decided the rules didn't apply to her. The next day, it happened again. Same SUV, same woman, same complete disregard for the fact that she was plowing across private property. She didn't even slow down at the gate this time, just pushed it open with her bumper like it was some automatic garage door waiting to serve her. By the third day, I started timing her. 7:45 in the morning, every morning, she came roaring through like clockwork. Then again at 5:30 in the evening, her own personal rush hour shortcut. By the end of that week, I was seething. This wasn't a mistake, this was deliberate. I mentioned it at the feed store, where folks gather to swap stories and complain about the price of hay. Some lady's been cutting across my land every day, I told them, trying to keep my tone casual. Doesn't even slow down at the gate. Old man Higgins, who's been here longer than dirt, chuckled and said, sounds like you've met Karen. Karen, I frowned. HOA Karen, another neighbor chimed in, rolling his eyes. Moved into that new subdivision by the East Ridge. She's got the whole neighborhood under her thumb. Runs the wall like a dictator. Tells people what color they can paint their mailbox and fines them if the grass is an inch too long. Yeah, Higgins added with a smirk. She once told me my fence was an eyesore when I drove by. My fence. The table erupted in laughter, but I wasn't in the mood to laugh. So she's just driving through my gate like she owns the place. She thinks she owns everything, someone muttered. From then on, the jokes came easy. Karen thinks she's the sheriff, they'd say, or, careful, she'll annex your barn into her HOA if you're not looking. Funny at the store, not so funny when I stood at my own gate watching her SUV nose through like I didn't exist. I tried waving her down once, stood right by the gate and raised my hand, expecting her to stop, roll down the window, maybe offer some half-hearted excuse. Instead, she sped right past me, the gust of air pushing my hat back on my head, her eyes fixed straight ahead like I was just a fence post. My blood boiled. She didn't even acknowledge me. Not a wave, not a nod, nothing. So I tried locking the gate. A big, heavy chain with a padlock that could stop a bull. I thought, that'll teach her. But wouldn't you know it, she showed up the next morning, got out of her SUV in her spotless sneakers, and unlatched the chain like she'd been doing it her whole life. I was too far away to stop her, just close enough to hear her mutter something about inconvenience as she swung the gate open and drove through anyway. That's when I realized, this wasn't just laziness. This was arrogance. She wasn't using my gate because it was convenient. She was using it because it made her feel powerful. The damage started small. Scratches on the wood where her bumper nudged too hard, the gate sagging a little from being pushed open every day. Then came the deeper scars. One morning I found the hinge bent halfway out of the post, splinters scattered on the ground. Another day, I caught the gate dragging in the dirt, warped from the constant abuse. Every time, I fixed it. Every time, she broke it again. Neighbors would drive by, see me working, and call out, "Gate trouble again." Don't tell me, it's Karen. And I'd grit my teeth, nod, and go back to hammering. At night, I'd sit on my porch, staring down the path she carved through my land, wondering what kind of person decided another man's property was nothing more than a shortcut. The thing is, ranch life teaches you patience. Cattle get out, fences fall, weather tears through everything you build. You learn to swallow your frustration and fix what needs fixing. But there's a difference between nature testing your limits and a neighbor stomping all over them. And Karen wasn't nature, she was pure, concentrated entitlement. One evening, after fixing the gate for the 4th time that week, I leaned on the post, sweat dripping down my back, and said out loud to nobody in particular, "All right, Karen. You want to play this game. You picked the wrong ranch." And in that moment, the idea started forming, the seed of a plan. I wasn't just going to fix the gate anymore. I was going to make sure the next time Karen drove through, she'd learn the hard way that this land wasn't hers to claim. She thought she was the sheriff, thought the world bent to her convenience. But out here, the land has its own rules. And I was more than ready to enforce them. I finally got her name the way most ranch gossip spreads, through whispers at the diner and chuckles at the gas station. Folks around here had been talking about her for months before she ever decided my ranch was her shortcut. They called her HOA Karen, like it was a title of nobility she'd knighted herself with, and from the stories I pieced together, it fit her like a crown. She was the self-appointed monarch of that new cookie-cutter subdivision on the East Ridge, the kind of place where all the houses look like they were cloned from the same soulless blueprint and the grass is trimmed within an inch of its life. Karen, of course, had risen to power the second the ink dried on the HOA charter, and she wielded her clipboard like it was a sword. Word was she'd find her own next-door neighbor $50 because his garbage can sat on the curb for 20 minutes past pickup time, and she once threatened to tow a teenager's car because the paint had faded and it diminished neighborhood standards. I thought those stories were exaggerations, the kind of small-town legends people love to pass around, but after watching her treat my ranch gate like her personal garage door, I realized those weren't jokes. Those were warnings. The first real conversation I had with her, or rather, the first shouting match, happened one Wednesday morning when I'd had just about enough. I stood by the gate, arms crossed, boots planted, determined not to let her roll past me like I was invisible again. Sure enough, 7:45 on the dot, I heard the growl of her SUV engine coming down the road, tires humming on asphalt before crunching onto my gravel. The gate was locked, heavy chain and all, and this time I had the key in my pocket. She pulled up, her sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, and instead of stopping, she tapped her horn twice like I was some hired hand late for duty. My jaw clenched. I didn't move. She rolled her window down, perfectly manicured hand drumming on the steering wheel. "Excuse me," she called, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness people use when they're really saying "move, peasant." "Can you unlock this? I'm late." I stared at her, taking a long sip from my coffee just to let the silence hang heavy. "Late for what?" I finally asked. Her eyebrows shot up above the rim of her oversized sunglasses. "Work, school drop-off, life. Does it matter? I've been using this road for weeks. It's faster." "This isn't a road," I said, tapping my boot against the dirt. "It's private land, my land. You don't have permission to be here." She gave a sharp laugh, the kind that said she was used to winning arguments before they even started. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just a gate. It's not like I'm hurting anything. Lady, you've busted the hinges 3 times. She waved that off like she was swatting at a fly. "I've got a busy schedule. I don't have time to drive all the way around the subdivision. Do you realize how much gas I'd waste? And besides," she leaned in, lowering her voice as if we were conspirators instead of enemies. "You've got plenty of land. What's a little shortcut to you? Now, I've met plenty of bold folks in my life. Ranching teaches you to deal with stubborn mules, both the four-legged kind and the two-legged kind. But I had never in my days met anyone who could look a man in the eye, trespass on his property, and then act like he was the unreasonable one." She tilted her chin in that signature way, like she was the queen granting mercy to a subject who'd annoyed her, and said, "You really ought to be more neighborly." That's when something snapped in me. "Neighborly," I repeated. "Neighborly is waving when you drive by. Neighborly is helping fix a fence after a storm. Neighborly is not tearing through my gate twice a day like you own the place." Her lips pursed, her patience clearly thinning. "Look, if this is about money, the HOA can compensate you. We've got a budget for community improvements." I almost laughed. "This isn't a community, this is a ranch, and that budget doesn't buy you a right of way." She sighed dramatically, leaned back in her seat, and shook her head. "I can see you're not going to be reasonable. That's fine, but just so you know, my husband's on the HOA board, and we're very connected in this county. It would be wise not to make things difficult." And with that, she revved her engine, gave the horn another honk, and backed out with a spray of gravel that peppered my boots. The nerve of that woman. The gall. I stood there long after her SUV disappeared, staring at the dust cloud she left behind, my fists clenching and unclenching like I was holding back the urge to march into that subdivision and tell every last one of her manicured neighbors what kind of dictator they were living under. Over the next week, the standoff escalated. I kept the gate locked, she kept finding ways around it. Once, I caught her slipping through when a delivery truck happened to be exiting, tailgating the poor guy so close his bumper nearly kissed hers. Another time, she parked her SUV, got out, and, this still makes my blood boil, she climbed the fence in her yoga pants, swung the gate open from the inside, and then drove through like she'd solved some grand puzzle. She was relentless. Every obstacle I set, she treated as a challenge to overcome, and every victory fueled her smug little smirk. The neighborhood gossip only added fuel to the fire. People told me she'd bragged at a homeowners meeting about her special shortcut that shaved 10 minutes off her commute. 10 minutes. She'd turned my gate into a badge of honor, proof of her superior efficiency, like she'd conquered the wild frontier by bulldozing over basic decency. Some even claimed she'd said, "That rancher doesn't need all that land anyway. He should be grateful I'm putting it to use." Grateful, as if I should thank her for smashing my property twice a day. It was around then that my humor started leaking out through the cracks in my frustration. Neighbors would ask, "How's Karen today?" And I'd respond, "Oh, she's just polishing her crown and measuring my pasture for a swimming pool." Or, "Don't worry, I'll be charging tolls by next week, $2 a wheel and half price for HOA members." But underneath the jokes, the anger simmered hot. Each day she got bolder, each day she pushed the line a little farther, and each day I felt the weight of her arrogance pressing down on my patience. One evening, after fixing the gate again, I sat on my porch with a beer, staring out at the dirt track her SUV tires had carved through my property. It wasn't just a path anymore, it was a scar, etched deep into the land, a daily reminder that she thought she owned me. And I realized then, clear as day, this wasn't about convenience for her. This wasn't about saving gas or cutting time. This was about control. Karen lived to bend rules, to assert her authority, to remind everyone else that she was in charge. But what she didn't know was that out here, beyond the reach of her subdivision bylaws and HOA newsletters, the land didn't answer to her. It answered to me, and I was starting to think the only way to teach her that lesson was to let her arrogance collide headfirst with the reality she'd been ignoring. Because one thing was certain, Karen might have been the queen of her plastic kingdom, but on my ranch, she was just trespassing. And queens fall hard when the crown slips. The first time I found the gate hanging half off its hinges, I thought maybe it was just the wear and tear of country life. Wood rots, bolts loosen, storms blow through with no regard for human effort. But when I bent down and saw the fresh scrape of white paint on the splintered post, the kind that matched exactly the glossy pearl finish of Karen's beloved SUV, I knew right then this wasn't nature. This was sabotage by negligence, and it had Karen's smug fingerprints all over it. The chain I'd wrapped around the gate lay in the dirt, not broken by rust or age but bent in a way that screamed it had been yanked with force. I stood there staring at it, jaw tight, because there are few things ranchers hate more than fixing the same problem over and over again because someone else is too arrogant to respect a boundary. So I fixed it again. New hinges, new post, fresh coat of sealant to keep out the weather. By the time I finished, my hands were blistered, my shirt soaked through with sweat, and my patience worn as thin as the wire I'd replaced on the fence. And wouldn't you know it, next morning, like clockwork, here came Karen, her SUV roaring like a jet engine, barreling through with the same casual entitlement as always. Except this time, she didn't even slow down. She clipped the gate hard enough to make it shudder against the post, her bumper scraping just enough wood to send a fresh splinter flying into the gravel. She didn't even look back. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just laziness or arrogance anymore. This was defiance. She knew I was repairing the gate. She knew she was breaking it. And she didn't care. No, worse, she wanted me to know she didn't care. Neighbors started talking. One evening at the diner, over a plate of chicken fried steak, I overheard Higgins telling a group at the next table that ranchers got more patience than job. If it were me, I'd have strung barbed wire across that path by now. Someone else chimed in, or dug a trench. Let her pretty SUV sink to its belly. They all laughed, but when the chuckles died down, Higgins leaned closer and said, if you don't stop her, she'll own your land next. That's how these HOA types think. They start small, then before you know it, they're telling you what color to paint your barn. I knew he wasn't wrong. But it wasn't just my land Karen was testing, it was me. Every time I hammered in a new bolt, every time I lifted the sagging gate back onto its hinges, it felt like I was giving her permission to keep walking all over me. And the more she pressed, the bolder she got. The second time I caught her climbing out of her SUV to tug the gate open herself, she tossed me a look over her shoulder that I'll never forget. It wasn't sheepish, it wasn't embarrassed, it was smug, like she was daring me to stop her, like I was just a speed bump on her way to wherever she thought she belonged. One afternoon, I was hauling feed when I heard the crunch of wood breaking sharp and sudden, louder than usual. I dropped the sack and sprinted to the gate. There she was, sitting in her SUV, bumper pressed against the gatepost she'd just split in half, wheels spinning gravel as she tried to push it farther open. The sound of the wood cracking under her tires felt like a gunshot in my chest. I shouted, "Stop, you're breaking it." She rolled her window down just far enough to toss her words out like trash. "If you built it stronger, it wouldn't break," she said flatly, and then revved the engine again until the post gave way entirely, the gate dragging pitifully behind her as she drove off without a care. I stood there, fists clenched, breathing hard, staring at the wreckage. The post lay cracked on the ground, hinges twisted beyond repair. It wasn't just a broken gate anymore, it was a declaration of war. When I went into town to buy new lumber, the clerk raised an eyebrow and said, "Another repair." I grunted something about bad luck, but the truth was sitting heavy in my chest. This wasn't bad luck, this was deliberate, and the whole town knew it. By then, Karen's reputation had spread beyond her subdivision. Folks told stories about her harassing kids for skateboarding too close to her street, yelling at a farmer because his tractor made too much dust, and even threatening to call animal control on a neighbor's hunting dogs because they barked at her while she jogged. It was clear she wasn't just an HOA tyrant, she was an equal opportunity menace. And now she'd set her sights on me. Fixing the gate that third time, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was winning. Every splinter, every bent hinge was her way of showing me that rules didn't apply to her. She had no respect for property lines, no fear of consequences. She was testing how far she could go, how much I'd take before I finally snapped. And I could feel it building in me, that slow boil of frustration turning into something sharper, something that whispered, "Enough is enough." I remember sitting on the porch that night, the cicadas buzzing loud in the trees, the heat of the day still clinging to the wood beneath me. I stared at the gate, now standing straight again thanks to my sweat and effort, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she broke it once more. My hands itched for a solution, not another repair, not another temporary fix, but something permanent. Something that would make her think twice before daring to trespass again. The land teaches you patience, but it also teaches you creativity. You learn how to outwit predators, how to reinforce a fence so even the craftiest bull can't push through, how to trap a coyote without ever letting it know the danger was there until it was too late. And as I sat there watching the gate, I realized Karen wasn't much different from a coyote, arrogant, relentless, always looking for an easy meal, never thinking about the consequences. The only way to deal with her kind was the same way ranchers had dealt with coyotes for generations: you didn't just repair the damage. You set a trap, Because the line had been crossed. The boundary wasn't just broken, it had been trampled, spit on, mocked. And if Karen thought my ranch was just another piece of land to conquer, she was about to learn what happened when arrogance met resistance. The thing about living out here is you learn early on that problems don't go away on their own, you fix them, or they keep circling back until they've eaten you alive. And after watching Karen grind my gate into splinters for the third, fourth, and fifth time, I realized no amount of hammering or welding was going to stop her. Repairs were just fuel for her arrogance, proof that no matter how much damage she caused, I'd always be the one cleaning up after her. That wasn't just trespass anymore, it was humiliation. And humiliation festers if you don't cure it. So I stopped thinking about repairs and started thinking about deterrence. Out here, deterrents come in all shapes. Barbed wire that bites, steel posts sunk deep enough to stop a bull, fences electrified just enough to make anything with a brain reconsider. The trick isn't the strength, it's the surprise. You don't win by meeting force with force. You win by letting the other fool walk headfirst into a trap they never saw coming. I spent days mulling it over while I worked. Driving fence posts, hauling hay, feeding cattle, all the while chewing on the same question: how do you stop a woman who believes she can't be stopped? I'll admit, the first ideas were more fire than logic. I pictured digging a trench right behind the gate and camouflaging it with brush, so when her SUV plowed through she'd sink to the axles like a hog in quicksand. Then I thought about stringing barbed wire just high enough to catch her windshield and teach her a sharp lesson about boundaries. But anger breeds recklessness, and recklessness breeds lawsuits. I didn't need a legal battle, I needed humiliation. Something that would break her pride, not her bones. So I scaled back, thought quieter, smarter. And then one night, sitting on my porch with a glass of bourbon, I remembered the steel stock gate I'd salvaged last spring. It was heavy, reinforced, built to hold back 1,000 pounds of bull if it came charging. I'd stored it behind the barn, figuring I might use it someday. Someday had arrived. The wood gate Karen kept destroying was like tissue paper to her SUV, but steel disguised with wood. That would look soft until the very moment it wasn't. That would be my equalizer. The plan clicked together like fence boards slotting into place. I'd mount a steel gate on reinforced posts sunk deep into concrete, then wrap the face with old weathered planks so it looked no different from the gate she'd been battering all summer. To her, it would be just another flimsy obstacle waiting to fold under her bumper. But when she hit it, it wouldn't fold. It would hit back. Preparation took days. I worked in secret, always glancing over my shoulder like I was building an outlaw hideout. I hauled out the steel frame under cover of night, using the tractor's headlights to guide me as I dragged it into position. By morning, I'd have the thing half buried in dirt or hidden behind a tarp so anyone driving past would think I was just mending fence as usual. I set the posts deep, pouring concrete thick enough to hold them steady against anything short of a tornado. Sweat rolled down my back, my muscles screaming, but every swing of the sledgehammer carried the sweet rhythm of justice. As the frame took shape, I couldn't help grinning at the thought of her face. I could see it clear as day, Karen in her spotless SUV, sunglasses glinting, smirk plastered on her lips, revving the engine with the confidence of someone who believed the world would part for her every time. And then, bam, the trap wouldn't kill her, wouldn't maim her, but it would strip that smirk clean off her face. Still, I knew better than to let myself get carried away. If I wanted to win, the disguise had to be perfect. So I spent another day cutting planks from old boards, weathered and splintered, the kind that matched the wood she'd been tearing through. I bolted them onto the steel frame, sanding down the fresh edges so they looked worn and gray. When I stood back, even I had to squint to tell the difference. To Karen's eye, it would be just another weak, patched-up gate. Only this time, the wood was nothing more than skin stretched over iron. Neighbors started noticing me working, but I brushed them off with vague answers. Fixing it stronger, I'd say when they slowed their trucks to ask. One fellow winked and said, "Stronger, huh? Sounds like you've got something up your sleeve." I just smiled and went back to my hammering. The truth was too sweet to spoil with words. Justice, I'd decided, works best when it's silent until the crash. The night before I finished, I sat in the dark on my porch, staring at the outline of that new gate standing tall against the moonlight. The cicadas buzzed, the air hung thick with the smell of cut hay, and for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. The trap was ready. Karen thought she'd been winning, thought she'd bent me under her will, but she was about to discover what happens when arrogance mistakes patience for weakness. Out here, we don't fight with lawyers or clipboards. We fight with ingenuity, grit, and a little bit of mischief. By dawn, everything was ready. The steel was hidden, the wood disguise flawless, the post solid as bedrock. I ran my hand over the surface, testing the seams, and chuckled under my breath. "Come on, Karen," I muttered. "Your throne awaits." As the sun climbed higher, I brewed my coffee and waited. I knew her schedule like I knew the patterns of my cattle. 7:45, without fail. Sure enough, right on time, I heard it, the low growl of her SUV drifting across the pasture like the distant rumble of a coming storm. My pulse quickened, my palms itched. I set my coffee down, leaned back against the porch post, and braced myself for the show. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing a problem is about to meet its match. That morning, I felt it deep in my chest, steady as a heartbeat. Karen had spent weeks proving she thought she couldn't be stopped. In a few seconds, she was going to learn the land doesn't bend to arrogance. The land bites back, and the best part, she'd never see it coming. The morning air was sharp enough to cut, the kind of crisp dawn that makes the world feel clear and certain, and I stood on my porch with my coffee cooling in my hand, waiting. It felt strange, like I was a fisherman who'd baited a hook and now had nothing left to do but watch the line. My trap was ready, my patience was spent, and Karen's arrogance was marching toward its reckoning. 7:45 came, and right on schedule one heard it, the throaty growl of her SUV echoing down the road like an approaching beast. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sweet taste of anticipation. I didn't move, I didn't pace, I just leaned back against the porch post and listened, because I already knew the end of this story. Her SUV rounded the bend, glinting in the morning sun like a polished weapon. She drove with the same iron certainty she always had, chin tipped up, sunglasses flashing, one hand resting casually on the wheel like she owned the road. I could almost hear the thoughts rattling around her head. Another day, another victory over the stubborn rancher too foolish to realize resistance was pointless. She didn't even hesitate as the gate came into view. The old wood facade looked worn and familiar, just as I'd planned, sagging in the exact way she expected, a sad little obstacle waiting to bow beneath her bumper. She gave it one last rev, a little flex of power, and then she went for it, full speed, all confidence, zero caution. The sound when her bumper met the steel core was like thunder splitting the earth. A hollow, ringing wham echoed across the pasture, followed by the metallic screech of her SUV's frame crumpling against a movable iron. The gate didn't budge an inch. Her hood buckled, headlights shattered, and in an instant, her smug shortcut turned into a wall she couldn't conquer. The airbag exploded with a muffled pop, slamming into her chest, pinning her against the seat in a white cloud that filled the cab like smoke. For a heartbeat, there was silence, stunned, absolute silence, except for the hiss of her engine coughing and sputtering, steam curling into the morning air. I nearly dropped my coffee laughing. It wasn't the cruel laughter of someone who wanted to see harm done, it was the triumphant laughter of a man who'd been pushed too far and finally watched justice land where it belonged. Karen sat there stunned, her hands flailing against the deflated airbag, her sunglasses askew on her nose. Her precious SUV, the gleaming chariot of her superiority, now looked like a crushed tin can leaking oil onto my gravel. She stumbled out of the driver's seat, hair wild, face flushed with fury, and the first words out of her mouth weren't apology or shame. "No," she shrieked, "you vandalized my car." I clutched my stomach, doubled over with laughter that carried across the pasture. "Vandalized," I called back between chuckles. "Lady, you just tried to drive through a gate. What did you expect it to do? Roll over and beg?" Her face twisted into something between rage and disbelief. She stormed toward the gate, heels crunching on gravel, waving her arms like a general rallying invisible troops. "This is illegal. You can't just booby trap your property like some kind of criminal. I'll sue you. The law will sue you." That last line broke me. I couldn't help it. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "The law," I echoed. "Ma'am, the law doesn't run my land. This isn't your subdivision. This is a ranch. Out here, the only law is respect." By then, the noise had drawn attention. A couple of neighbors driving by slowed their trucks, their jaws dropping as they took in the scene. Karen standing red-faced in front of her mangled SUV, the indestructible gate standing tall and proud like a sentinel of justice. One fellow leaned out his window and hollered, "Looks like the gate finally won." Another whipped out his phone, no doubt recording the whole mess to show everyone at the diner later. Word travels fast around here, and Karen had just given the town its juiciest story in years. Karen, realizing she was the star of a show she couldn't control, grew even wilder. She jabbed a finger at me, shouting about negligence, endangerment, property rights, all the legal buzzwords she could think of, but none of them landed. The neighbors laughed, trucks idled, and I just stood there calm as a preacher on Sunday, sipping my coffee while she unraveled. It was the kind of moment you couldn't script if you tried. Finally, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up, drawn by the reports of a wreck on the ranch road. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, hat low, eyes taking in the scene with the kind of patience only a man who's seen every sort of foolishness can muster. He walked slow, hands resting on his belt, and gave Karen a long, steady look before turning to me. "Morning," he said dryly. "I hear we've got ourselves a situation." Karen pounced like a lawyer smelling blood. "Sheriff, thank goodness. Arrest him. He sabotaged his gate. He tried to kill me." Daniels blinked once, slow as molasses, then turned his gaze back to her SUV crumpled like a soda can against the gate. He knelt, tapped the steel frame with his knuckle, and whistled. "Well, I'll be damned. That's some fine reinforcement work right there." He stood, brushing the dust off his pants, and fixed Karen with a look that could level a man. "Ma'am, far as I can tell, you tried to drive through another person's property." Again, her jaw dropped. Again, he sighed. "We've had calls, ma'am. Folks seen you do it. Not once, not twice. Regular as sunrise. This gate isn't the problem. The problem is you treating private land like it's your driveway." The crowd of neighbors chuckled, nodding in agreement. One even called out, "Tell her, Sheriff." Karen sputtered, flailed her arms, tried to summon the same authority she wielded back in her subdivision meetings, but out here her words were empty. The sheriff held up a hand, calm and final. "I'm writing this up as property damage and reckless driving. If I were you, I'd be more concerned about paying for that car of yours than blaming the man whose land you trespassed on." The look on her face was priceless, like someone had yanked the crown right off her head. Her empire of threats, fines, and finger-pointing didn't mean a damn thing here. She was just another trespasser caught in the act, humiliated in front of half the county. As Daniels wrapped up his notes, Karen climbed back into her battered SUV, the door screeching as it closed. She didn't look at me. Didn't look at the neighbors. She just sat there behind the wheel, red-faced and trembling, before slowly backing away from the gate that had finally stood its ground. I stayed where I was, coffee in hand, grinning like a fool. The land had spoken, the trap had worked, and for the first time in weeks, the gate stood unbroken, proud, and whole. Justice hadn't come with lawsuits or shouting matches, it had come with the solid ring of steel and the crash of arrogance meeting reality. And as Karen limped away in her wounded chariot, I couldn't resist calling after her, "Funny thing about shortcuts, they always end up taking longer in the end." The neighbors roared with laughter, and I took another sip of coffee, savoring the sweet, smoky taste of victory. The dust had barely settled on the morning of Karen's spectacular crash when the story started spreading like wildfire. By the time I made it into town for feed, the whole place was buzzing. I walked into the diner, bell jingling above the door, and every head turned like I was Wyatt Earp strolling into a saloon. Old-timers grinned, waitresses smirked, and someone hollered from the back booth, "Heard your gate finally grew a backbone." The laughter that followed rattled the windows. Word traveled fast in small towns, but when it came to Karen's downfall, it traveled at lightning speed. Folks wanted every detail: how I'd reinforced the gate, how fast she'd been driving, how red her face turned when the sheriff shut her down. I told the story once, slow and measured, letting the suspense build, and by the time I described the crash, half the diner was doubled over laughing. It wasn't just about me or my ranch anymore, it was about watching arrogance meet its match. People ate it up, every word, and in that moment, I realized Karen hadn't just embarrassed herself, she'd cemented her reputation as the town's cautionary tale. Back at the ranch, the evidence of her tantrum still sat plain as day. The gate stood tall and unbothered, steel frame gleaming beneath the wood facade, while her SUV had left a jagged skid mark across the gravel and a little puddle of oil that shimmered like a trophy. Every time I walked past it, I couldn't help but chuckle. I knew she'd be back eventually, not in her car, but with that trademark righteous fury, but for the first time, I wasn't worried. The power balance had shifted. She had no cards left to play. Sure enough, 2 days later she returned, not with an SUV this time, but with a clipboard clutched in one hand and a fake air of authority clinging to her like cheap perfume. She marched up to the fence line while I was fixing a trough, and I watched her rehearse whatever speech she'd cooked up. She cleared her throat, raised her chin, and announced, "I've filed a formal complaint with the HOA." I nearly dropped my wrench from laughing. "Karen, for the last time," I said, wiping my hands on a rag, "this isn't your HOA. This is my ranch. The HOA doesn't govern a damn inch of it." Her face twitched, but she pressed on, flipping her papers for effect. "Well, they've promised to escalate this matter. They will not let you endanger residents with reckless behavior." "Reckless," I repeated, savoring the word. "Lady, you drove your car through a gate. That's like blaming the sidewalk for tripping you after you closed your eyes and ran." Her lips quivered, her fingers clenched around the clipboard, and I swear she came within a hair's breadth of throwing the whole thing at me. Instead, she huffed, spun on her heel, and stomped away, muttering about lawyers. But I noticed something important. Her steps were smaller than before, her shoulders tighter. She wasn't strutting anymore. She was shrinking. The sheriff must have paid her a visit, because the very next week, she stopped showing up altogether. No more morning trespasses. No more screeching SUVs through my gate. The pasture grew quiet again, the cattle grazed in peace, and the gate stood proud like a monument to hard-earned victory. It was as if the land itself sighed in relief. But the legend of Karen's crash didn't die. If anything, it grew. At the feed store, at Sunday service, even at the bar on Friday night, folks kept retelling the story with their own flourishes. Some swore she'd flown 10 feet when the airbag went off, others claimed she screamed like a banshee the whole time. I never corrected them. Why would I? The truth was funny enough, but the myth was downright legendary. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip low, a neighbor stopped by with a six-pack and a grin. "Heard Karen's been real quiet," he said, handing me a bottle. "Guess she finally realized the HOA crown don't mean much outside her castle." We laughed, clinking bottles, and for a moment I thought about how thin the line is between peace and chaos. A single person, drunk on power and arrogance, had tried to bulldoze through my life, and for a while, she'd almost succeeded. But in the end, all it took was one well-placed stand, steel and grit, to remind her that respect can't be demanded, it has to be earned. Weeks passed, and the wreck faded into memory, but the lesson didn't. Every time I walked through that gate, I remembered the look on her face when her SUV crumpled, when the sheriff sided with me, when her HOA crown slipped right off her head. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every neighbor she'd bullied, every resident she'd threatened with fines, every person she'd treated like dirt under her heels. I hadn't just defended my ranch, I'd defended the principle that out here, arrogance doesn't get the last word. And then came the sweetest twist of all. Word got around that Karen had put her house up for sale. Couldn't handle the whispers, the sideways looks, the embarrassment that followed her like a shadow. By summer, she was gone, moved back to whatever city first crowned her HOA queen, leaving behind nothing but stories, skid marks, and the memory of her downfall. The neighborhood breathed easier, the ranch road stayed quiet, and life returned to the way it should have been all along. On the last night before she left, I stood at the gate one more time, looking out at the road, and thought about everything that had happened. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, and the sky was painted with stars, wide and endless. I smiled, not out of malice, but out of relief. Karen had come storming into my world like a hurricane, certain she could bend it to her will, but in the end, it was the simplest truth that stopped her: this land wasn't hers to take. As I turned back toward the porch, I said it out loud, to no one in particular, just to the night and the land that had stood with me. Funny thing about shortcuts. Sometimes they're the longest road to humiliation. And with that, I shut the gate behind me, the click of the latch ringing out like the final word in a story that would be told for years to come.